All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on what part of the world you're in. If you have been following the news this week, you know there has been some activity in the physical and cyberspace between the United States and Iran. And the Photon research team has been all over it with numerous blogs. We've done a podcast on it. We thought we would do a quick video with me and Dr. Richard Gold, who is our Director of Security Engineering at Digital Shadows. Thanks for
Hello
joining us.
there.
Thanks for joining, Rich.
Yeah, my pleasure. Anytime.
So Rich is one of our go-to folks on the team when anything breaking comes out. And if you followed him in the past, he's done a lot of work looking into Mitre attack and mappings. And one of the things that's really important to us is to have practitioner-focused content. You've no doubt seen a lot of clickbait in the news this week talking about Iranian cyber threats. I did a separate blog on 9 pieces of advice that I had that were very pragmatic and not clickbaity. And this is just the continuation of that theme that Digital Shadows likes to take whenever there is a breaking news or something that's important to your defense of your environments. So, Rich, why don't you kind of talk through the blog that you did in the broader set of content that we've been producing, and then you and I are going to kind of do a Q&A through different parts of your blog.
Yeah, sure. So it's pretty interesting to look at how Iranian APT groups typically behave. We've seen a few of them over the years, whether it's Oil Rig, APT-34, APT-33. They have many different names. I did a mapping for one called the Rana Institute back in last year. But basically, what I wanted to do was to look at a couple of the APT groups. So we looked at APT 3334 and Rana Institute, and break down the tradecraft that they use when they're conducting their offensive operations using the Mitre ATT&CK Framework. The Mitre ATT&CK Framework, for those of you who don't know, is a common vocabulary used to talk about how intrusions happen. So it walks through the different stages of the intrusion, from how the actors gain their initial access, how they moved around in the network, and how they accomplish their goals at the end. And alongside that, we wanted to give practical advice for what you can do about it. And the Australian Signals Directorate, which is like the Australian Signals Intelligence Agency, has a really great set of mitigation strategies called the Essential 8. I really like them because they're very pragmatic, and they really boil it down to the absolute most critical controls that you need to have in place to protect your organization. So by putting together Mitre ATT&CK Framework and the Essential 8, we can have a good overview about how these APT groups function, what kind of tradecrafts they use, and then what we can do about it.
And for those that may not be from the intelligence community, the ASD is essentially the US version of the NSA, or the UK version of GCHQ. And they all partner together in the Five Eyes community. One of the things that I like about this, and I wrote it in my blog as well, I gave a little shout out to what was coming, is that this is useful, and it's useful against other actors. We are not recommending something silver bullet-y. You will notice as we go through this is probably applied to 80% of the threats that you have. I mean, let's be clear. If a nation state wants to target your organization, it doesn't matter who it is, they're going to be able to have success. Iran may not be as sophisticated as the United States, the UK, China, and Russia, but certainly since the days of Stuxnet, they have grown in sophistication, and it would be an unwise choice to kind of mock Iranian offensive cyber capabilities. That could end up in a bad way.
Right, and it's also interesting to see that it's not a million miles away from some of the commodity threats that we see, like the Emotets, trickbots, quackbots of this world. So if you're protecting against them, you'll have then the fundamentals in place, which also help you on the way to protecting against these APT groups.
Well, let's go ahead and dig into it a little bit. Why don't you walk through what we got?
Right. So the Mitre ATT&CK framework breaks down an intrusion into a number of steps. And so this slide covers the initial access and execution, which is how the intruders breach the perimeter of the organization in the first place. And there's a couple of different ways that these APT groups, typically linked to Iran, functioned. And it should come as no surprise, but straight up the top is spear phishing. Now, whether it's spear phishing with an attachment, or spear phishing with a link, these are very, very common techniques used by these groups. And so it really is one of the number one controls to get in place in the organization to deal with this, is to handle how attachments arrive via email or via, for example, social network services into your organization. There was a great report from FireEye talking about how some Iranian groups were using LinkedIn, for example, to distribute these malicious attachments. So understanding how attachments get in via email or social networking and what happens to them once they get in. For example, are they containing malicious macros? That's still a very, very common technique used by attackers to this day, and to the extent that the ASD Essential 8 has a specific control. One of the 8 controls is dealing with macros. As well, a complementary one is hardening of user applications. So that's also like turning off things like only embedding if you don't need it, DDE, these kinds of things. So spear phishing is absolutely, as with many, many groups, as you said, Rick, it's the way that they get in.
Yeah, when you said groups the first time, I kind of grinned because I thought to myself, and by that, Rich means all groups. I mean, everyone uses phishing. So this will, again, you're not, in my blog on Iran, I called it, let's not, oh my God, Iran, cyber attack kind of thing. These type of controls will help with everyone. The one thing I would say as well, pragmatically, we're going to give some guidance. I called it just do the boring, was kind of my joke on it. But it's not to say these things are all easy to do. If you're going to disable macros, you probably want to talk to your accounting teams, different departments, to make sure that they're not using it, or be running in a mode where you're monitoring on it. So we don't mean to say that these controls are necessarily easy to implement. They take time, especially for a global Fortune company, that sort of thing. So they are the basics, and we recognize that the basics aren't easy, and that's why they've been such a challenge for us for decades.
Right, and that's why attackers are still using spear phishing with macros, because it is hard to get a handle on it. But understanding, I think, that it is something that is so vital to attacker tradecraft, I think, then gives you a bit more impetus to try and get a grip on it. And also Microsoft, for example, have recognized that. And there's a lot more controls now in the Office suite and Office 365 for getting to grips with macro execution. That's only allowing signed macros. Now you can even say only macros which did not come from the internet can be executed, and so on. So there's a lot of nuance there, but there is, I think, now we're in a better position in terms of tooling and support from the vendors to get a handle on these kind of things.
All right, what's next?
Right, so yeah, the other sort of main way that they get in is through some kind of network services. Now that is sometimes is using exploits, tends to be more in the way of using stolen credentials. So that's the valid accounts tactic here down at the bottom, but also exploiting publicly facing applications is also something which they've been known to do. So like legacy servers or vulnerable servers, FTP, that kind of thing. But absolutely the RDPs and SSHs of this world, making sure that the accounts for these, like you have two-factor where it's possible. If you can't use two-factor, then to have some kind of other compensating control, such as IP whitelisting, putting it behind a VPN or something. But this is something, if it's a single factor authentication system exposed to the internet with not the same kind of controls that you would like to have, that's something which is going to be very tempting for attackers. So that's definitely the flip side to the spear phishing, is coming in over the network using vulnerable or lightly configured services.
I think another area, and we've already seen some of the hacktivists doing defacements and things along those lines, the bottom feeders, well, all across all groups, but in particular, if we're talking about Iran, they're going to be going after this sort of stuff as well. So not only will you see it at the bottom end, but the more sophisticated actors use it as well. So this helps you across the spectrum. Again, key point for this, it's going to help you with a wide swath of threat actors and varying capabilities that they have.
Yeah, absolutely. Should we move on to the next? So yeah, once the attackers have got in through their either the spear phishing or exploitation of a publicly facing service, then they tend to look for additional credentials, typically privileged credentials, to then move onward from there and throughout the network. And that can be done in a number of different ways. We've seen things like just actors looking for credentials which are left in files. So whether it is actually a text file containing passwords, or whether it's private keys left on the disk, that's one thing. Another thing which is very common is the usage of open source tools such as Mimikatz. So it's doing some kind of credential dumping. Now, whilst the Essential 8 doesn't have a specific attack, a specific control around dealing with credential dumping, using application whitelisting, restricting administrative privileges, and so on, is a good way to keep on top of these kind of things. And I think one thing that we've seen from these Iranian APT groups, they're very happy to use existing tooling, open source tooling. And so being aware of what that tooling is and how to defend against it, it's open source. You can get it from GitHub or from inside of Kali or something like this, and you can try them yourself in your environment, of course, with the appropriate authorization. But then you can see how well things work or don't work in your environment. I think that's sort of the cornerstone of the purple team kind of approach that we take here at Digital Shadows.
You may have seen, if you were following the Twitter drama in our community over Christmas, lots of talk about offensive tools used by defenders that are also used by the adversaries. And there was quite a lot of drama out there. And it goes back to the whole concepts of living off the land. Not only are they going to use the tools that we use in purple teams, but they're going to use the blue team tools that we use to PowerShell as an example, right? They're going to use legitimate tools so that it makes it harder for detection. There was one other point I wanted to bring up on this one, Rich, which just around some of the things that we see on GitHub. We've done presentations at DEF CON this year, and we did B-Sides DFW, and we were doing open source reconnaissance, and we were looking into, you know, I joke around, GitHub is a target-rich environment.
Yeah.
And so if you're wanting to maybe talk a little bit about what we're seeing from a defender perspective on some of the things, private keys and credentials that are actually exposed on GitHub and people don't know it.
Yeah, it happens very, very regularly. I think one of the very common things we see is, for example, config files from a piece of software that someone has configured, and they've pushed the whole source tree to GitHub and sort of forgotten that it contains access credentials or usernames, passwords for databases and other systems. We also see API keys. Amazon, for example, is very hot and working with GitHub on detecting the usage of AWS keys when they're pushed to GitHub and then invalidating them in minutes, which is fantastic. But that's just one example. There's many others.
It's not fantastic if you're doing a live demo at B-Sides DFW
right, exactly.
and your account gets burned in minutes. So it was a very impressive collaboration between GitHub and AWS. Yeah. It did complicate our training session a little bit, though.
Right, and so that's great for that, very, very big ticket kind of organizations. But when it's something more custom, more bespoke, these kind of automated scanners are not going to pick them up, as they simply won't know about them. So being aware of that kind of thing is very common. But like JDBC connection strings and this kind of stuff, we see a lot of credentials just seeping out onto GitHub from all kinds of different sources. So being aware about what can store credentials and where they go, I think is crucial. Yeah.
Against all threat actors.
Indeed.
Was there anything else that we need to cover on this one?
I think we can move on.
All right.
And yeah, so once the attackers have then they've got in, they've moved around the environment, they found their targets. They then have to do some kind of collection. There is a mission, and I think that's something which often gets lost when discussing APT Tradecraft, is that these attackers have a goal. They have something that they want to achieve, and that is all that they care about, really. So they may get domain admin and use Mimikatz to pull all the the plaintext creds out of a domain controller, but they may not if they don't need to do that. So we've seen that. So the PowerShell example that you mentioned earlier, Rick, is a good one. We've seen that with some of these Iranian APT crews, that they use PowerShell a lot for this kind of collection, for, in this kind of example here, getting data from the local system and network shared drives, staging the data, pulling data from information repositories, the automated collection. The Iranian APTs have been known to be doing this as well. So using PowerShell as the automation framework for doing that. And now with the latest versions of Windows, Microsoft gives you very, very good controls, like the script logging and AMSI and these kind of things, to get a view on what PowerShell is executing in your environment. We have a blog from our colleague, Isidoros Monogiolis, which really breaks down the key points about how to use PowerShell defensively. So if you're curious about that, I highly recommend having a look into that. I think it's a great resource.
That's actually, let me just give some props to Isidoros on that. That blog is several years old, and it continues to be one of the top blogs that we have. For, again, it's actually the similar theme of what we're trying to accomplish this week. It's pragmatic advice for defenders to help them harden their environments. It's not hyperbolic, it's useful. Yeah. And that's
we
just,
also
that's our theme.
Forced him at gunpoint to update it last year as well.
Yeah,
so.
it has been refreshed. So we'll make sure to add that to the notes on this particular one, so you can see that as a reference.
Yeah, so I think that's a very good point to keep in mind, is that you mentioned like the living off the land, using the existing tooling, the existing environment to their benefit is, of course, a very, very key attacker technique. So understanding what's available to attackers inside of the environment and how you can keep an eye on it is very useful. EDR and SIM solutions are very useful here for picking up what's being executed. Even health check monitoring can be useful here. Certain attacks have been detected when systems ran out of disk space. So being aware about that kind of health information from your environment is also very useful. And yeah, I think you had a podcast on Shadow Talk this week talking about practical things that people can do for this.
Yeah, again, it goes back to the practical bit. So I did this Oh My God Iran blog, and then we did the podcast on it. And again, similar to the approach here, I mean, nothing that we covered here is earth-shattering or is some super elite technique to stop advanced APT actors, right? These are fundamental controls, just do the boring, as I put in the blog, that can help you out. And the podcast is a good place to follow up. We'll have every week Shadow Talk is produced. I join it from time to time. Rich joins it from time to time, and we'll have a new session coming out this week where we'll do a little bit of an update on Iran, but also other news that's out there, and then we'll continue to monitor the space and update you guys with it. Rich, is there any kind of closing thoughts that you would have or final recommendations?
Yeah, I really recommend looking at the ASD Essential 8 for those critical mitigation strategies. Mitre ATT&CK is, of course, very, very useful for breaking down attacker tradecraft. But if you're really interested in like what are the most critical controls I can put in place in my environment to protect against these kind of APT attacks, which we've seen being linked to Iran, I think that's a great place to start. And exactly as you say, doing the basics. And as you say, it's not easy. It's simple, but it's not easy. But that is the way to get those fundamentals in place, which can help you defend against not only these kind of actors, but the commodity threat actors and beyond that to other APT crews.
Well, thanks everybody for joining us and taking some time out of your day to listen. And feel free to hit us up on social media. My handle is Rick H. Holland. And Rich has one of my favorite ones. I'll let him say it, but I absolutely love Rich's Twitter handle.
Dr. Shellface.
It's great. Every time I hear it, I laugh. So thanks again, everyone, and we'll talk to you online.